A 10-minute walk right after your meal beats a 30-minute walk taken half an hour later for blood sugar control. That's not a typo, the short walk wins every single time. In a 2025 clinical trial, a 30-minute walk starting 30 minutes after eating was no better than doing nothing at all, but a 10-minute walk taken immediately, that significantly reduced the glucose spike. The timing window is narrower than most realize, and the research on why is really, really cool. I'm Dr. Cal. I spent 7 years working in the NHS before leaving to study longevity full time, and now I dedicate my work to translating the science of aging into advice that you can actually use in your daily life. For this video, I've gone through 22 peer-reviewed studies, randomized control trials, meta-analyses, and mechanistic research to build the most evidence-based guide I can on how walking affects your blood sugar. I've linked every single one of them into a citation library. It's in the description so you can check out any of the research for yourself. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through three things: the biological mechanism behind why walking blunts your glucose spikes, the exact timing and duration the research supports, and if you stick around to the end, I'll give you a practical protocol that you can start using after your next meal. Now, to make sense of why any of this matters, it's worth understanding what actually happens in your body after you eat. When you consume a meal, your blood sugar rises. It typically peaks around 60 to 90 minutes later and then gradually returns to baseline over the next 2 to 3 hours. That peak, also called the post-prandial glucose spike, is the period of greatest metabolic stress. And here's what most people don't appreciate. Postprandial glucose predicts cardiovascular disease better than fasting glucose. It predicts coronary artery disease, it predicts all-cause mortality, and this is true even in people without diabetes. The mechanism is well established. Each glucose spike triggers a cascade of oxidative stress. Your cells produce reactive oxygen species that activate inflammatory pathways, and over time, this impairs the endothelial cells lining your blood vessels. Think of each spike as a small insult to your vasculature. One spike doesn't really matter that much, but thousands of spikes repeated over years and years and eventually decades, that's how metabolic damage accumulates. The question then becomes, how do you blunt these spikes? And the answer turns out to be remarkably simple. The first thing to understand is why walking after a meal has such a powerful effect on blood sugar, and it comes down to a single molecule inside your muscle cells. Your muscles contain a glucose transporter called GLUT4. At rest, these transporters are sequestered inside the cell, hidden away in vesicles. They're doing absolutely nothing. But when your muscles contract, even gently, GLUT4 transporters move to the cell surface. This is called GLUT4 translocation, and the result is a 50 to 100-fold increase in the rate of glucose absorption into the cell. In simple terms, muscle contraction opens the doors that lets glucose flood into your cells from your bloodstream. Now, here's what makes this so powerful. There are two parallel pathways that drive this process. First, when your muscles use up energy, a sensor called AMPK detects the deficit and signals, actually, we need more fuel, we need more energy, and this triggers GLUT4 to move to the surface. Second, every time a muscle fiber contracts, calcium floods into the cell, and that calcium signal independently triggers the same GLUT4 translocation. And here's the critical part: neither of these pathways require insulin. That matters enormously for anyone with insulin resistance. If your cells don't respond well to insulin signal, which is the core defect in type 2 diabetes, your response to muscle contraction is still there. The contraction-mediated pathway bypasses insulin sensitivity entirely, and that's what makes it such a powerful tool. This is why walking after meals works even with people with type 2 diabetes. Their insulin signal is impaired, but their muscles still respond to the movement, and you don't need intense exercise to activate these pathways. Even a light walk at 3 to 5 kilometers per hour is enough to trigger meaningful GLUT4 translocation. Alright, the second point, and this is where the research gets really interesting, because it turns out that when you walk matters more than how long you walk. In 2025, a team of researchers put this directly to the test. They ran a randomized control trial with 3 groups. One group did a 3-minute walk immediately after ingesting glucose. Another group did a 30-minute walk starting 30 minutes later, and a control group did no walking at all. Peak glucose in the immediate walking group was 160 milligrams per deciliter. Peak glucose in the delayed walking group was 176, and peak glucose in the control group was 182. The 30-minute delayed walk, despite being 3 times longer, was not significantly different from doing nothing at all, but the 10-minute immediate walk produced meaningful reductions in glucose. A 2023 meta-analysis of 8 randomized controlled trials also supports this pattern. Post-meal exercise was superior to pre-meal exercise and superior to the control group, but critically, each additional minute of delay reduced the effect. There are 3 reasons immediate timing works so much better. First, walking right after eating blunts the rate of glucose absorption from your gut. The glucose enters your bloodstream more slowly. Second, you catch the insulin secretion ramp up period. Your pancreas is just starting to release insulin, and walking enhances insulin sensitivity at exactly the right moment. Third, and this is the key insight, you prevent the glucose spike from ever reaching its peak. Rather than trying to bring glucose down after it's already elevated, you stop the elevation from happening in the first place. The takeaway is simple. Start walking as soon as you finish eating, or at the very latest, within 15 minutes. Now, the natural follow-up question is, how long do you actually need to walk for? The research shows a clear dose-response relationship with diminishing returns beyond a certain period. At 2 minutes, you start to see a measurable effect on glucose. At 5, you see moderate reductions. At 10, you hit the sweet spot for practical effectiveness. This is what the 2025 timing study used. And at 15 minutes, you've got well-established clinical benefit. But here's the finding I think is most practical. A 2013 study compared 2 protocols in older adults at risk for impaired glucose tolerance. One group did 3 15-minute post-meal walks, one after each meal, and the other group did a single 45-minute walk in the morning. Same total walking time, very, very different results. Both improved 24-hour glucose control by about 10%, but the post-meal walking protocol was significantly more effective at controlling post-dinner glucose, the spike that tends to be the highest and most problematic. A 2022 meta-analysis reinforced this. Accumulated exercise, so multiple short bouts distributed across the day, was more effective than a single continuous bout, specifically in non-diabetic populations doing low to moderate intensity exercise. The practical implications are clear. 3 10 to 15 minute walks, one after each meal, gives you 30 to 40 minutes of total daily walking, distributed for maximum metabolic impact. That's far more effective than cramming it all into a single session. Here's something that I find really reassuring about the research. You don't actually need to walk that fast to achieve good benefits. A 2012 study published in Diabetes Care compared breaking up prolonged sitting with either light intensity walking or moderate intensity walking. Participants did 2-minute walking breaks every 20 minutes. In the study, light intensity meant 3.2 kilometers an hour, barely above a stroll. Moderate intensity meant 5.8 to 6.4 kilometers an hour, which is more of a brisk pace. Both reduced total glucose exposure by 24 to 30% compared to uninterrupted sitting. That's not just peak glucose, that's the entire area under the curve, the total amount of glucose your body has to process. Both intensities also reduced insulin levels, meaning the pancreas didn't have to work as hard. What this shows is that the difference between the light and moderate exercise groups was not statistically significant for glucose outcomes. Now, if you want the maximum possible effect, there is evidence that high intensity interval walking outperforms steady moderate walking. A 2020 study in type 2 diabetes patients found that alternating between fast and slow walking was more effective than consistent moderate walking. But here's the reality. Most people aren't going to do high intensity intervals after every meal, and they don't really need to. The guidance is simple. Walk at a pace where your breathing is slightly elevated, but you can still speak in full sentences. That's roughly 3 to 5 kilometers per hour, depending on your general fitness. That is all you need to achieve these results. Point 5, the long-term evidence. I want to cover this briefly because the short-term glucose reductions are impressive on their own, but the long-term data is what makes this a genuine clinical intervention. So let's look at data on HbA1c, as this is a marker of long-term glucose control. A 2018 study in type 2 diabetes patients compared post-meal walking to a single pre-breakfast walking session, so same total exercise, different timings. Post-meal walking produced greater HbA1c improvement. When researchers switched participants from pre-meal to post-meal timings, HbA1c improved significantly. When they switched them back, the benefits were lost. And a 2024 study combined walking with arm rotation exercises after meals 5 times a week for 24 weeks. The results: HbA1c reduced by 0.5 percentage points and postprandial glucose reduced by 25 milligrams per deciliter. To put that into perspective, a 0.5% HbA1c reduction is comparable to what you would expect from first-line diabetes medication. This is a clinically meaningful intervention and it costs absolutely nothing. Okay, so how do you actually implement this? Here is your evidence-based protocol. When? Immediately after eating or within 15 minutes at the latest. How long for? 10 to 15 minutes per meal. How fast? Light to moderate pace. Breathing slightly elevated, but you can still speak comfortably, roughly 3 to 5 kilometers an hour. How often? After each main meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This gives you 30 to 45 minutes of total daily walking distributed across the day for maximum metabolic impact. To make this practical, treat the post-meal walk as part of your meal routine, the same way that you clear dishes or wipe down the table, plan a route around the block to the post box and back, a loop through your neighborhood, whatever works for you. Start with one meal. Dinner is usually the highest glucose spike, so that's where you get the most benefit for your time. Add other meals in gradually. For different populations, if you have mobility limitations, standing or marching in place also activates these pathways. You don't have to walk outdoors. And for gestational diabetes, this is a safe intervention that's well supported by the research. That's the current state of evidence on walking after meal. The timing window is narrow. The first 15 minutes after eating is where the benefit concentrates. The dose is small, 10 to 15 minutes of light walking, and the mechanisms are robust. Muscle contraction drives glucose uptake through a pathway that doesn't even require insulin. Now, if you want to understand how to structure your overall exercise routine for longevity, including strength training, VO2 max, and zone 2, I've made a video on that topic that goes deep into the research and I will link it somewhere around here. As always, I've included every study referenced in this video into a citation library. It's free and the link is in the description below. Let me know in the comments what your biggest barrier to walking after a meal is and if there's a topic you would like me to cover. If you found this useful, subscribing helps it reach more people. Until next time, look after yourselves.